Welcome to Healing Wisdom, a Thursday morning talk show featuring guests sharing their stories and knowledge. We discuss the healing aspects of the arts, metaphysics, social justice, and adventure through all types of terrain. So join me, Pandora Peoples, here on WOMR 92.1 FM in Provincetown and WFMR 91.3 FM in Orleans. We're streaming worldwide at WOMR.org. Our guest today is Max Dashu, feminist historian, author, and artist, founder of the Suppressed Histories Archives. Her latest book, Women in Greek Mythography, looks at the sexual politics of war and captivity, conquest and enslavement, and what we didn't learn about women in Greek myth and iconography in school. This book is volume 2, book 1 in the series Secret History of the Witches from Valletta Press. You can find it at vallettapress.net. It focuses on the spiritual culture of ancient Greece from 1600 BCE to 300 CE, and the shift away from more matrilineal to more patriarchal cosmologies. And also, we get so much beautiful information on so many lost goddess figures and female deities, delve into dream and birth caves and so much more. So thank you so much for being back with us to talk about this today.
It's my great pleasure. Yeah, the book is really a mixture of things because all of us were raised with Greco-Roman civilization as the great standard of education. And so it's all shoved down our throats, which is one reason I avoided for a long time looking into this history. I mean, I do global women's history, but this one, I resisted it because it is so mandatory. And the way it's taught is very different. When I delved into actually looking at the sources and seeing them from a woman-centered point of view, and also looking at African and Asian influences on the Greeks, because what we're taught is, the Greeks started all these wonderful things. And you don't realize that there's all these other Asiatic and African forces going on that affect the Greeks. And so just to turn it all around and put women at the center and then see what the great classics look like to us, whether it's the Iliad and the Odyssey and all the profound patriarchy that is just pivotal to their whole stories, or whether it's the Greek playwrights or the philosophers, and even just the religion, because Greek mythology really pretty much dominates the teaching of mythology for most people, and the planets are named after them, and the days and all of these things, so much of our cultural frame of reference is Greek, right? Even the words we use in medicine or science or mathematics come from Greek. And so it's a framework. And the problem with the framing is that the patriarchal assumptions that are embedded into this, like, for example, Greek mythology, you've got the Olympian gods, and there's this one top dog, and he dominates all the rest of them, and they're all afraid of him, and he punishes his wife, and he actually tortures her by hanging her up in the heavens with anvils tied to her ankles. How dare she talk back to him? And he's constantly insulting her. And this is becomes normative for Western Civ. And really what I'm trying to do in this book is look at the foundations of patriarchy and colonialism too in Western Civ. Because, this was all taught. This is how it is. This is the great model we must all follow. And then you look at that model and you think, well, that's what they had, right? That's all there is. So there are other scholars like Carol Christ and Charlene Spretnak and many others who have looked into the origins more deeply and saying, well, wait a minute, there's these other goddesses. What about them? And what are they like? And really, how do they fit in as pre-patriarchal figures? What would it be different, especially for women, to look at this and see that there are these older forms? And so the subtitle of the book is actually Pythias, Melissae and Titanides. And the Titanides are the god, they're called the old gods. This is the female form that I'm using, but the former gods is one of the phrases that we see used for these deities. They are the ancestral deities before the Olympians. So if you look at the cosmology, you start with night, and then parthenogenetically, night bears Gaia, and Gaia is the great Earth Mother. And then Gaia bears Uranos, which is the heavens. And then she mates with her son, and then a whole bunch of other Titans are born from that. So these are the forces of nature. And they, in turn, one of the Titans that's born from Gaia, well, two of them actually, there's Rhea and Saturn, Kronos, actually, in the Greek. And so Zeus is their child, among several others. So how does he become the dominant figure when he's actually the great-great-grandson of these older female deities, right? And so we realize there's this whole pre-story that's basically a matricultural layer. Going back, we don't really know how far. And this gives very different ideas about what being female is. So it's a different kind of a interpretation. And the last of this generation of deities is Hecate. So she's not actually an Olympian. She kind of gets grandfathered into the Olympians. But it's very interesting because these goddesses resist patriarchy. And even the male Titans are not necessarily models of patriarchy. So, the Nereus, who is the god of the oceans, he is kind and truth-telling. And Prometheus, which is one of the younger of the male Titans, he defends the mother. And when the mother comes under attack, he puts himself at risk in order to prevent harm to the mother, right? Or to the mother-in-law. So there are also positive male models as well as for women in these older narratives, but they've been suppressed. And the classical Greeks were very much taking pains to put them out of the picture. And so they're pushed underground, or they're, defeated and overthrown. Different kinds of stories are told about them. So I thought it was valuable to dig them back up and see who they are, because they're still present in Greek mythology here and there, and then also to look at what happened to the goddesses, because Hera is pretty much a battered wife, but a rebellious one. And so you have that whole group of stories. And there's a way in which the goddesses, Athena too, as well, are patriarchalized. So Athena goes from being a very old snake goddess. She has serpents emerging out of her body in some of the old iconography, to becoming the daddy's girl who enforces the will of her father Zeus. And she becomes a war goddess, right? And she becomes an upholder. So if you read Aeschylus in the plays, she becomes the upholder of male domination. And when there's conflict between male and female, Aeschylus has the one story where in the story of the Atreides, I'm trying to think of the name of it's a series of plays, but anyway, Orestes kills his mother because she killed his father. And so then the question arises, what is worse, to kill your mother, matricide, or for a woman to rebel and kill her husband? And Athena says, I am always with the male. I am always for the male. And so she sides with the male gods because there's a tie. And she sides with the male gods and says Orestes can go free. And she participates in the defeat of the Furies, the Eumenides, and they are driven underground. So they're giving kind of like a treaty deal where they're going to sort of stay out of the picture, but they're still there somehow under the altar. And
just to clarify, this happens over time.
Yes.
As we change and evolve, as we go from a more matrilineal culture that's influenced by other cultures at the time, like Anatolia,
right.
to your pre-patriarchal.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's even an intermediate stage, because I don't think that the Proto-Greeks were matrilineal. They're Indo-Europeans. Mm-hmm. But there are layers and layers here, because you have the Neolithic cultures, and they are definitely matricultural. And we see this in the iconography, and there's no sign of warfare or state formation or class systems at that period, like say in 5000 BCE. Somewhere around 2200 BCE, the early Helladic people come. They're one of the Indo-European invasions, and they come in, and their language becomes the dominant language. But here's an interesting piece, and I do talk about the new genome history as well in the book, that what they found out in the last, 10 years, is that the Greeks and the Cretans, who everybody always thought were separate because they knew the Greeks were Indo-Europeans and the Cretans are something else that we're not even sure what their language was, right? Because we never deciphered Linear A. But they found out that the genome of the Cretans and the Mycenaeans is mostly similar. So what that means is Indo-European conquerors came in. It was the old pattern of kill the men, rape the women, right? Or marry the women. Over time, there was an assimilation so that the empty DNA is the old kindreds. And then over that are these dominant, so what happens is you have the Greek language and Indo-European culture on the mainland, but they're still related. And that's why the art is so similar. It's not just that they had all these imported Cretan artists. They were descended from that culture too. But the Greeks come up with this much more patriarchal culture because of those Indo-European influences going on. So there's a mixture going on.
And with the islands, we have Sybil, who's like the snake goddess, and we have all of the sort of Minotaur-related fertility goddesses and gods, right?
Yeah. So Crete, what we have to understand about Crete is it was protected by the sea. It didn't get those invasions until quite late, somewhere around 1400 BCE. Then the mainlanders invade Crete and they destroy a bunch of things. And there's like this period of practically nothing. And then around 1300, the Cretans kind of recover and you see a recurrence of the snake goddesses. Oh, there she is right there in my background. This is the classical Cretan form around 1600 BCE or so. But then 300 years later, they begin making new terracotta statues of women holding snakes in their hands or sometimes crowned with snakes. So there is a cultural continuity that they kept, the Cretans, even in later periods. But anyway, there's these complexities and layers of history because a lot of times people try to interpret it as all or nothing. And it's a process. Patriarchy comes in layers. It's a historical process. So I'm trying to track that from the levels of archaeology, linguistics, genome studies, historical records, but also, the mythic record is really important because the Greeks mythologized this patriarchal takeover.
We're speaking with author-historian Max Dashu about her book, Women in Greek Mythography.
For an example, the Oracle of Delphi is originally consecrated to Gaia or to Gaia, to the earth, and her daughter Themis, which is divine law. Apollo comes and he takes it over. There's a couple of these conquest stories where Apollo takes over the old oracular centers and puts them under his own rule. But he doesn't completely, like in the case of Delphi, there's now a priesthood of Apollo who's administering the place, but you still have the ecstatic snake women. The female oracles continue right up until, 391, when the Roman emperors closed the whole thing down. So we know that this oracular center was going for at least 1,000 years, and maybe even 1,500, because some Greek traditions say that the Oracle of Delphi predicted the Trojan War, which would have happened before 1200 BCE. And so that would be 1,500 years total.
And can you speak to the oracular tradition and how that, and possibly even the weaving tradition and the spiritual influence of women and priestesses in those times that predated this sort of takeover of Apollo? Can you talk about the importance of caves, which are very feminine, obviously? And just before you answered, Pandora's box, her Pythias, her urn-shaped vessel,
right.
It's a very feminine symbol. And the name means all gifted and all giving. There are remnants of the pre-classical period Pandora as first woman who was not demonized or cast in a negative light. So can you speak to the auricular tradition?
Yeah. So first, just while you mentioned Pandora, so the all-giver, and then there's a story by Hesiod and other Greek writers make her into the source of all evil. But she's really an origin, she's an origin point, and the jar is a symbol of the womb. And, what's contained in that jar is, as you say, very feminine symbol. But then what happens is that in the new rewrite of this, the overwriting of the old story, Zeus gives this to her and it's sealed, and he tells her, do not open it. And she disobeys. So because she disobeyed Zeus, and he intended this, he knew that she would disobey. She, not he gave the evils, but she's the one that opened it. So now it's her fault, unleashes all the evils into the world. And Zeus is this way in a lot of the stories. He's malign. He doesn't like humanity. He's constantly harming and punishing humanity. At one point, he sends a flood and everybody is destroyed except for one couple, right? And they survive on one of these hilltops. It's actually the hilltop of Delphi. And so, his negativity is very much spelled out. Nevertheless, there's this way in which it gets projected back on the female figures. And so Hera, for example, is made into the bitter wife and, is always going around punishing other women. And these are often women or goddesses or nymphs who are raped by Zeus. They aren't even really having affairs, which is one of the biases of the literature. And Zeus loved X. And Apollo fell in love with Y. But actually, these are rape stories, right? They have nothing to say about it. But anyway, so that's Pandora. But then with the oracular traditions, this is clearly very old. There's the serpentine imagery, the Pythia, which is the title for the Oracle of Delphi, it means snake woman. And so there's this serpent element. And so here's the interesting thing about Delphi. This is a shrine that was very ancient. It's on a mountain. Mount Parnassus is up, rearing up above it. And Delphi turns out to be a place where two earthquake faults intersect. These two geologists figured this out in the 90s. The exact place where the Adyton, the Holy of Holies, which is a semi-subterranean chamber where the prophecies took place, was there at that intersection point. Somehow they knew this. And so it's limestone rock. And when there are small earthquakes and the limestone rubs together, it releases ethylene gas, which makes you high. So there were stories about this that the Greeks told, including sometimes the Pythia would drop dead, too much gas, right? From what they called the mephitic vapors. Anyway, this chamber was a place of ecstasy, and there's a spring also running through it that starts way up high in the mountain, and it's associated with these two nymphs. So Apollo takes the shrine over from these nymphs and from Gaia. And yet, in spite of all those developments, there remains the prophetic woman. And she's sitting down in that semi-subterranean chamber, and she goes into an ecstasy. And we don't know anything about how these women were chosen, how they were trained. I'm thinking the local women of Delphi somehow might have been a pool from which candidates were spiritually selected. The shamanic spirit sickness, we don't know how they were chosen because hardly anything is told to us about the actual women. There's a few places where Plutarch and some of the other sources say, well, they give us a few names, right? Femenoe and a couple other names. And they do say at one point that a man comes and rapes the oracle. And so they make a rule that they have to be over 50 years old, and that prevails for a while. So there's all these overlays of stories. But what we know is that they go into ecstasy and they prophesy in verse. And so there's this inspired spiritual state that they enter into. And this becomes the greatest, perhaps, of all the oracular centers in the Mediterranean. I think probably there was one at Malta. There were certainly the Egyptian oracles, and there was Delphi. And people came from all these countries to consult this woman, and it was a female line. So the priests were there in the background. Modern scholars try to say, well, the priests interpreted her prophecies, and it was really, she was just babbling and she didn't know what she was saying. And there's all these projections basically over what was still actually a surviving female prophetic line. So one of the stories is one of the kings in Anatolia, one of the Lydian kings. He does a test of all the oracles because he has this very important invasion. He wants to expand his empire. He's going to find out which oracle is the most accurate. And so he sends it to Delphi and a bunch of the others, and he has a question, and he says, what am I going to be doing on such and such a date? And so Delphi has the correct answer. You're going to be boiling a tortoise in a bronze cauldron in a certain way. So he realizes, wow, Delphi, that oracle really knows it. So, okay, I'm going to ask my question. So his question is, what if I invaded and crossed the river and invaded the neighboring country? And the oracle says back, if you do this, a great kingdom will be destroyed. And he decides that's the green light. So he does it. And it's his kingdom, which is destroyed.
No.
And so there's all these countries, and this is paradoxical because these are patriarchal times. I'm not arguing, that Greece in the first millennium BC, or even before that, was matriarchal. I mean, the Mycenaeans are already a patriarchal society. But there is a way in which a female sphere of power survived. At Delphi and other places, the priestesses of some of the temples in Greece had a public official authority that was very important, so that they were pronouncing on laws and disputes and foundations of nations, all these kinds of things. Their input was powerful in that way.
We can see the shifting paradigms in many mythological traditions. For example, there were sun goddesses at a certain point in time and moon gods, and then there was a switch all over the world where the sun became associated with men and the moon became associated with women. And one of the things that we don't learn in school is that the ancient Greeks had deities for every element of nature, and it was very animistic. It was very earth-centered. And at one time, the night was embraced more than feared, and the black of the night was seen as yin, a space of endless potential, a restorative place, a feminine place, a safe place of gestation from which seeds are born, from which we are rebirthed. When the sun is born again at the winter solstice, the light returns. So when we look back at very ancient cosmologies, the night is sort of the womb, and the cosmos is also the home of the ancestors, as well as the place from which we are born. Can you talk about the goddess Night of ancient Greece?
Nyx, or Night, is a really interesting figure because, she continues to be touched on, like even in the Orphic traditions, which are quite late antiquity. They really kind of come to the fore. Even at that point, she's an oracle. So this oracular element. And there's a way in which there's an overlap of goddess and priestess within the Greek tradition. You'll even see that in the imagery, because goddesses, and this goes for Isis and Cybele also in other countries nearby, are shown with an offering plate in their hand, or pouring libation, or doing kinds of priestessly acts. Isis with the sistrum is an example of that. But Nyx is there as this primeval force. And then there's a whole group of these other goddesses. Dawn Work McKenna refers to them as collective goddesses, and she's done a lot of study on this, where it's not even just one named goddess, but it's like a whole group that are, like you're saying, the animacy of the water goddesses. So you have the sea goddesses, and Thetis, who is one of the Titanides, is kind of the leader of all the sisters who are the ocean goddesses. And then you have the naiads, who are the sweet water, the spring water goddesses, and that includes the nymphite. So the nymphs, we get the nymphs as an entirely sexualized group of goddesses who are often being raped by Hermes or Zeus, or they're just sex objects in the art, that are eye candy for the male gaze. But when you look into it, you were asking before about the caves. There are all these caves of the nymphs. And there's evidence both in the iconography there, but also in written tradition about oracular traditions around the caves, and also especially dancing by the caves. So they're doing these dances for the nymphite. And sometimes they're connected with Artemis, sometimes they're connected with Hera or other goddesses. Even Athena has her own nymphs at her shrines. And so they're very much about the land, caverns and springs coming out of the caverns, and so it's the water is life principle. These are things that Greeks had in common with the whole rest of the world. It's not different in its core elements. There's all these overlays of patriarchal mythologizing that come into it, right? But then there are also nymphs of the mountains, and they become very important, even in some of the stories about the gods, like Dionysus. They save him from being killed by his enemies. And there are the nymphs, which are the tree nymphs. So the dryads and the hamadryades, these different groups. And so this is something I think is really important to understand, is that a lot of what we're given as Greek mythology is something was written down by men and were official cults of state. Okay. So Zeus and Apollo and all of this, but what also existed all that time is the local people, and especially the local women, and the ceremonial activity that they carried out year after year over centuries and millennia. And they loved those traditions. They kept them, they carried them on. And so in daily life, the nymphite or any other goddesses that are located, that are localized to a particular shrine, women are coming there with offerings. They're celebrating births. They're carrying out funerary ceremonies for the ancestors at those places, and have everything to do with daily life, which is why in the 1800s, and this is after Christianization, this is after the Roman Empire, Christianization, the Middle Ages, the Byzantine Empire, Greece being occupied by the Turks, all these things happen. The local people at Eleusis, where Demeter and Persephone were revered, were still honoring the statues of the two goddesses, as they were known in Greek. And along comes this British colonial, and he wants to carry off one of the statues, and the peasants are up in arms because they still say the fertility of our fields depends on these statues and the offerings we're making to them. And so they fought him, but he paid off the Turkish officials, and he carried off one of the statues he started to carry it off to Britain, but the ship sank. She didn't want to leave. There's all these stories about a goddess who the pirates try to seize her and carry her away, but the ship cannot move. Well, this ship sank, and eventually they did recover it and take her to England. But there were other statues of Demeter of the same set. There were these gigantic propylaea, these pillar portals of Demeter. And there was one of them that's surviving there that continued to be honored by the peasantry as Saint Demetra. So the common people were stubborn. They carried these traditions through, and they might rename them or they might not. I mean, the Parthenon got turned into the Church of the Holy Virgin when, in the Byzantine Empire after Christianization, people hung on. So it's really important to recognize that those survivals happen, because what we're given is the elite narrative, right? So when we're looking at the Iliad and the Odyssey, this is what elite men love to hear about. So it's all glorifications of heroes. And the goddesses are actually made to look very bad. They have Hera slapping Artemis over the face, even as Artemis is being referred to by her ancient title, Potnia Theron, the Lady of the Beasts. So we get both nectar from those sources, and we get a lot of poison, in the way that they pitch it to us.
We've been speaking with historian Max Dashu, founder of the Suppressed Histories Archives. You can hear the rest of our interview at healingwisdomradioshow.com. You can also find it on Apple Podcasts under Healing Wisdom, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. You've been listening to Healing Wisdom with Pandora Peoples. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, and Happy New Year.